September 1980, downtown Cleveland, Ohio, inside a courthouse, lawyers representing one of America's oldest vehicle manufacturers file a stack of paperwork that will end an 80-year story. Chapter 11. Bankruptcy protection. Outside, the company's name is still stamped on trucks hauling freight across every state in the country. Inside, the numbers tell a different story. A company bleeding money so fast that within just 15 months, it will lose $311 million. The company is called White Motor. And if you've never heard of it, that's exactly the point of this story, because for most of the 20th century, White wasn't some obscure regional manufacturer. It was one of the biggest names in American trucking. It built the vehicles that hauled freight through 2 world wars. It once outsold nearly every competitor on the road. Presidents rode in its cars. And within a decade, it would collapse so completely that its own name would eventually disappear from the American landscape entirely, not because of one scandal, not because of one reckless executive making one catastrophic call. What happened to White Motor is something quieter, and in a way, something far more common and far more unsettling than a dramatic collapse. It's the story of a company that did almost everything right for 80 straight years, and still lost. To understand how a company survives 80 years, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and decades of brutal competition, only to fall apart in the space of about 10 years, you have to go back to 1898, to a broken boiler in Cleveland, Ohio. Thomas White isn't a truck man. He's a sewing machine manufacturer, and a successful one. He built the White Sewing Machine Company into a real Cleveland institution starting back in 1876. But around 1898, Thomas buys himself a steam-powered car, a locomobile, and quickly discovers its boiler is dangerously unreliable. Rather than just return it, he hands the problem to his son. Roland White is an engineer with a Cornell education and a restless mind. He redesigns the boiler completely, inventing what's called a flash boiler, a safer, more controllable way to generate steam on demand. It works so well that his father lets him build an entire automobile around it using a corner of the sewing machine factory. By the spring of 1900, 4 steam cars exist. By the end of that year, White has quietly built and sold nearly 200 of them. In 1901, the 3 White brothers, Roland the engineer, Windsor the administrator, and Walter, who later handled military relationships, formally organized the automobile side of the business. They call the car the White Steamer, and almost immediately it starts winning. 4 White steamers enter the New York to Buffalo Endurance Run in 1901. All 4 earned first-class certificates. The following year, a White wins gold in the New York-Boston-New York event. In 1903, another gold medal, this time in the New York to Pittsburgh Run. And in July 1905, a specially built racing White, nicknamed Whistling Billy, driven by a man named Webb J., sets a world mile speed record of 73 3/4 miles per hour at a track in New York. This isn't a hobby project anymore. This is a company built by a sewing machine manufacturer that is now genuinely one of the fastest and most respected names in the entire American auto industry. Roland White himself is awarded a gold medal for his steam engine design at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and it goes further than trophies. A 1907 White steamer becomes part of the very first official White House motor fleet, used by the Secret Service to follow President Theodore Roosevelt's horse-drawn carriage. Both Roosevelt and his successor, President Taft, personally own White steamers. For a moment, this small family-run offshoot of a Cleveland sewing machine company is quite literally carrying the President of the United States. But steam power has a shelf life. Gasoline engines are getting more reliable, more practical, easier to fuel. And by 1907, the Whites make a decision that will define the rest of the company's existence. They start building their first trucks. It's a smaller, quieter pivot than the racing headlines. Nobody sets a speed record hauling freight, but it's the decision that actually saves the company long term. When World War I breaks out, the U.S. military needs trucks, thousands of them, reliable, rugged, built to survive terrible roads and worse conditions. White answers the call, manufacturing more than 18,000 military vehicles for the war effort. By 1918, White controls roughly 10% of the entire American truck market. Walter White himself travels to France to help coordinate motor transportation for the War Department. After the war, White doesn't go back to passenger cars in any serious way. It leans all the way into trucks, and for a while becomes the #1 maker of trucks and custom commercial vehicles in the entire country. In 1928, the company introduces its Model 59, one more step in a steady, confident climb. And then the ground disappears beneath every American manufacturer at once. The Great Depression doesn't just slow White down, it nearly kills it. Sales collapse across the entire auto industry, and in 1932, a weakened White Motor Company temporarily merges with Studebaker just to survive the worst of it. It's not a triumphant partnership. It's closer to two wounded companies leaning on each other so neither falls over completely. 2 years later, in 1934, White pulls itself back out, reorganizing independently as the White Motor Corporation. Under a new leader, Robert Black, the company doesn't just survive, it rebuilds itself specifically around heavy-duty trucks and buses, the exact niche that had quietly kept it alive through the war and the 20s. In 1933, right in the middle of all this turmoil, White's Cleveland workers organized themselves into UAW Local 32, one of the very first automobile labor unions anywhere in the country. It's a detail that barely makes the history books at the time. Decades later, it becomes a lot more relevant. By 1935, White has recovered enough confidence to land something genuinely prestigious, a contract to supply its Model 706 buses to the National Park Service, carrying visitors through Yellowstone National Park. From near collapse during the Depression to hauling tourists through America's most famous national park in just 3 years, it's a real comeback story. And for the next 2 decades, White keeps building on it. After World War II, White Motor goes on an acquisition spree, buying up smaller truck manufacturers one after another. Sterling, Auto Car, Diamond T, Rio, absorbing competitors and building what looks from the outside like an empire. Each one of these names had its own history, its own loyal customers, its own factory floor somewhere in industrial America. One by one, they get folded into White, keeping their own badges on the hood but answering ultimately to Cleveland. The results are staggering. In 1950, White's annual sales sit around $130 million. By 1967, that number has rocketed to $770 million, nearly a 6-fold increase in less than 2 decades. White also starts distributing Freightliner trucks under an agreement with Freightliner's parent company, and between its own brands and that distribution deal, White becomes known across the industry as one of trucking's Big Four, standing shoulder to shoulder with names that are still household brands in trucking today. To anyone watching from the outside in the late 1960s, White Motor doesn't look like a company with a ticking clock hanging over it. It looks like a company that can't stop winning. It doesn't stop at trucks either. In 1960, White buys the Oliver Farm Equipment Company. 2 years later, in 1962, it acquires Cockshut Farm Equipment of Canada. The year after that, Minneapolis Moline on paper. By the mid-1960s, White Motor Corporation looks less like a truck company and more like an industrial conglomerate. Trucks, buses, tractors, farm equipment spread across an entire continent. Then, in 1968, White makes the acquisition that, in hindsight, starts the countdown to its own destruction. White buys Euclid, Inc., a manufacturer of massive off-road hauling trucks, hoping to break into a lucrative market it doesn't already dominate. It's an ambitious move. It's also an incredibly expensive one, and White finances much of it through debt. Debt piled on top of debt from years of buying up smaller companies. For the first time, the empire White has spent decades assembling is standing on genuinely shaky financial ground in 1970. White tries to solve the problem by merging with White Consolidated Industries, the large industrial conglomerate that had itself descended from the old White Sewing Machine Company, the very business that started this whole story 70 years earlier. It's almost poetic. It's also a failure. The deal falls apart. Desperate for a fix, White's board goes looking for star power. In 1971, they hire Simon "Bunky" Knudsen to take over as chairman, a genuine celebrity in the auto industry, the son of a former General Motors president, and himself, the former president of Ford Motor Company, famously and very publicly fired by Henry Ford II just 2 years earlier, in a boardroom split that was messy enough to make national headlines. If anyone can walk into a struggling truck company and turn it around through sheer reputation and experience, the thinking goes, it's a guy like this. It's the corporate equivalent of hiring a star quarterback to save a losing season in the fourth quarter, For a moment, it almost looks like it's working. In 1973, White Motor posts a $20 million profit, the first real good news in years, but it isn't enough. Not nearly enough. That same year, the 1973 oil crisis hits, sending fuel prices soaring and shrinking demand for the kind of heavy, thirsty trucks White specializes in. Years of accumulated debt from the Euclid acquisition and the broader buying spree of the 60s are still sitting on the books, refusing to go away. Knudsen does what he can. He sells off roughly a third of the company's assets, including, almost unbelievably, the profitable Euclid hauler operation itself. The very company White went into debt to acquire in 1968 gets sold off just a few years later in a desperate attempt to raise cash. It's the financial equivalent of amputating the limb that was supposed to save you. Knudsen also moves company headquarters out of downtown Cleveland's Erie View Plaza to the quieter suburb of Eastlake, and starts cutting jobs across the workforce. Later in the decade, truck production itself gets shifted away from White's historic East 79th Street plant in Cleveland, the plant where this whole modern chapter of the company had been built, down to non-union facilities in Virginia. The old Cleveland plant, once central to the company's identity, gets converted into a facility that just makes parts. White's product lineup is also, by now, dangerously narrow. The company never properly built out a lighter-duty truck range to compete across the whole market. It's still leaning almost entirely on heavy trucks, at exactly the moment the industry is shifting underneath it. By 1978, White builds just 13,330 units for the entire year. For a company that once commanded 10% of the American truck market, it's a shockingly small number. Then in 1979, a second oil crisis hits, and this time, there's no more fat left to cut, no more profitable subsidiaries left to sell, no more Bunky Knudsen magic left to try. Talks of a merger with Daimler are explored, talks with Renault are explored, nothing sticks. By 1980, White Motor Corporation is quietly, unmistakably insolvent, a company that once carried the President of the United States, that once ran 10% of the entire American truck market, that survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, run completely out of road. In September 1980, White Motor files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It is by any measure one of the largest industrial bankruptcies in Cleveland's history over the following 15 months. As the company limps through bankruptcy proceedings, it loses $311 million. In August 1981, Sweden's AB Volvo steps in and buys most of White's American truck manufacturing plants for roughly $75 million, a fraction of what the company had once been worth. Notably, Volvo doesn't take the old East 79th Street plant in Cleveland, the historic heart of the company. It's too old, and it's carrying a pension liability too large for Volvo to want to inherit. Meanwhile, up in Canada, White's remaining assets, including its plant in Kelowna, British Columbia, and its Western Star truck nameplate, get purchased separately by 2 energy companies out of Calgary, Alberta. The empire that once stretched across an entire continent is now being carved up piece by piece, plant by plant, by buyers who mostly just want the parts that still work. White finally sells off that original Cleveland plant in 1983, settling pension and benefit obligations with the very workers whose union had organized itself there back in 1933, the same East 79th Street site where trucks had rolled off the line for the better part of 6 decades, now reduced to a real estate transaction and a settlement check. And after years of prolonged, grinding bankruptcy proceedings, the White Motor Corporation officially ceases to exist as a company in 1985. Volvo keeps the White name alive for a while, stamped on trucks under the Volvo White and later White GMC badges, a quiet echo of a company that used to build its own presidential cars, but by the late 1990s, even that name is gradually phased out and retired for good. 80 years from a broken steam boiler on a rich man's hobby car to a company setting speed records and carrying the President of the United States. From near collapse in the Great Depression to becoming one of trucking's big 4, from 10% of the entire American truck market to a bankruptcy courtroom in downtown Cleveland, and finally, to a name quietly stripped off the sides of trucks it no longer owned. Nobody destroyed White Motor with a single bad decision. There was no dramatic scandal, no single villain, no one afternoon where everything fell apart. It was slower than that, and in some ways sadder than that. Decades of ambitious growth, layered debt, one acquisition too many, and an industry that shifted twice in the same decade, right when the company had the least room left to absorb the shock. The trucks are still out there, though. Restored white cabovers and conventional models still roll into truck shows across the country, their old triangle badge still catching the light on a warm summer afternoon. The same triangle that once sat on a car following Theodore Roosevelt's carriage down a Washington street, now sitting quietly in a collector's garage in the American Midwest. There's a strange kind of lesson buried in a story like this one. White Motor didn't fail because it stopped innovating, or stopped building good trucks, or stopped winning contracts. Right up until the final years, it was still respected on the road. What it couldn't survive was the weight of its own ambition, decades of acquisitions financed on debt, arriving at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong decade, when two separate oil crises and a shrinking product lineup left no room left to maneuver. 80 years of momentum, and in the end, momentum wasn't enough to outrun the math. It's the last visible trace of a sewing machine company that, for 80 years, quietly helped build the roads America still drives on today.